I thought my wife was practicing a new language. She was calling for help. My wife, Elena, started speaking in strange phrases 3 months ago. I'd walk into the kitchen and hear her muttering words that sounded vaguely Slavic or maybe Nordic, repeating them under her breath while she chopped vegetables or loaded the dishwasher. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled and said she'd signed up for an online language course. She said it was Russian, something she'd always wanted to learn, and that speaking it aloud helped her memorize vocabulary. I thought it was charming. We'd been married 8 years, and Elena still found ways to surprise me with new interests and hobbies. She was always taking classes or learning skills, photography one year, pottery the next. A language course seemed perfectly normal. I encouraged her, even bought her a Russian cookbook as a joke, thinking we could make it a shared experience. She thanked me, but the book sat unopened on our shelf. The phrases continued, random and frequent, always when she thought I wasn't paying close attention. I'd hear her in the shower, in the car, folding laundry in the bedroom. The sounds were rhythmic and repetitive, and after a few weeks they became background noise, no more notable than the hum of our refrigerator or the distant sound of traffic from the highway. But then I started noticing patterns that didn't fit. Elena would say the same sequences of sounds in specific situations. When the doorbell rang unexpectedly, she'd mutter a particular phrase under her breath before answering. When her phone buzzed with texts, she'd whisper another set of words while reading the screen. At first I thought maybe these were practical phrases she was trying to contextualize, the Russian equivalent of hello or thank you. But the timing felt off, too consistent, too tied to moments of apparent stress. Elena had always been calm and composed, but lately there was tension in her shoulders that never fully released, a tightness around her eyes that made her look perpetually worried. I asked if everything was okay at work, and she said yes, just busy. She was a research analyst for a pharmaceutical company, a job that required attention to detail and long hours, but had never seemed to stress her this much. When I suggested we take a weekend trip to decompress, she declined, saying she couldn't afford to take time off right now. That seemed strange, because Elena had always prioritized work-life balance, and we had plenty of vacation days saved up. But I didn't push it. I figured she was dealing with a difficult project and would return to normal once it wrapped up. The phrases became more urgent around week 6. Elena started saying them more frequently, sometimes in rapid succession, her voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. I walked into our bedroom one evening and found her standing at the window, staring out at our quiet suburban street, whispering those strange words in a loop while tears ran down her face. I asked what was wrong, and she jumped, startled by my presence even though I'd made no effort to be quiet. She wiped her eyes quickly and said she was fine, just frustrated with herself for struggling to master the language. She said Russian grammar was harder than she'd anticipated, and she was considering giving up. I put my arms around her and told her she didn't need to be hard on herself, that hobbies were supposed to be enjoyable, not stressful. She leaned into me for a moment, then pulled away abruptly and said she needed to make a phone call for work. She left the room with her phone clutched tight in her hand, and I heard her pacing in the guest room for the next 20 minutes, her voice low and intense, though I couldn't make out the words. When she came back, her face was pale, and there were new tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. That was when I knew something was seriously wrong. I decided to research Russian language learning to better understand what Elena was experiencing. I downloaded a few language apps and started going through basic lessons, figuring I could surprise her by learning along with her, and maybe reduce some of her stress by making it a joint activity. But when I compared what I was hearing in the lessons to what Elena was saying, nothing matched. The sounds were completely different. Russian had specific phonetic patterns, consonant clusters, and rhythms that were distinctive. Elena's phrases had none of those characteristics. They didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard, not European, not Asian, not anything recognizable. I started paying closer attention to exactly what she was saying, trying to transcribe the sounds phonetically. After a few days of careful listening, I had a notebook full of strange syllables. Seku rita, repeated often. Domestic treta, said, when looking at her phone. Fai nanshul com pro mahiz, whispered in the bathroom. I stared at these transcriptions and felt something cold settle in my stomach. These weren't foreign words. They were English words disguised by unusual pronunciation and stress patterns. Security, Domestic threat? Financial compromise? Elena wasn't learning a language. She was trying to tell me something. I confronted her that night after dinner. I showed her my notebook with the transcribed phrases and asked her to explain what was really going on. Elena's face went white, then red, then white again. She stared at the notebook for a long moment before looking up at me with eyes full of terror and something that might have been relief. She opened her mouth to speak normally, then stopped herself and instead said very carefully in her strange pronunciation, "Kaham puter mahant or surveilled." I felt my blood go cold. Computer monitor surveilled. Someone was watching us through our devices. Elena pointed at the laptop sitting open on our kitchen counter, its camera facing the room. Then she pointed at her phone on the table. She picked up a pen and wrote on the back of an envelope. "They're always listening. Can't speak normally. They said they'll hurt you if I tell." Her hand shook so badly the letters were barely legible. I took the pen and wrote, "Who is they?" She wrote back, "Jeffrey Vaughn, my former supervisor. He has leverage. Been forcing me to give him research data. Threatened to kill you if I don't comply, or if I tell anyone." Jeffrey Vaughn. I knew that name. Elena had worked under him 4 years ago, before he was fired from the pharmaceutical company for ethics violations. Elena kept writing, filling up the envelope and then grabbing napkins, her handwriting getting more frantic. She explained that Jeffrey had contacted her 3 months ago, right when her strange language started. He'd somehow obtained evidence of a mistake Elena made years ago when she was his research assistant, a data entry error that had made it into a published study. The error was minor and unintentional, but Jeffrey had documentation showing Elena had been the one to input the data. He was threatening to expose her as having falsified research results, a career-ending accusation that could result in criminal charges for scientific fraud. But that wasn't the worst part. Jeffrey had also been stalking us, had installed surveillance equipment in our home, and had made it clear he knew my schedule, my route to work, where I bought coffee every morning. He'd told Elena that if she went to the police or told me what was happening, I'd have an accident, a fatal one. So Elena had complied, passing him proprietary research data from her current company, valuable pharmaceutical information that Jeffrey was apparently selling to competitors. But Elena was smart. She knew she needed help and she couldn't ask for it directly. So she'd created a code, disguising English distress phrases as a foreign language, hoping I'd eventually notice and investigate. She'd been dropping clues for 3 months, getting more obvious as time went on, escalating to crying and showing distress when I didn't understand. I took the pen and wrote, "Can we leave? Get to police station." Elena shook her head violently and wrote, "He's watching. Real-time monitoring. Has someone following us? I tried to go to police last month. Made it 3 blocks before someone called and described exactly where I was. Said you'd be dead before I reached the station. Turned around." I felt rage and helplessness in equal measure. We were prisoners in our own home, monitored constantly, threatened with violence if we sought help. I looked around our kitchen, trying to spot cameras or microphones, but saw nothing obvious. Jeffrey must have installed professional equipment, the kind that was small and hidden in everyday objects. I wrote, "How do we stop him?" Elena wrote back, "I don't know. I've been trying to figure it out. Need to get evidence against him without him knowing. But I can't access anything without being watched." I thought for several minutes, then wrote, "Keep pretending everything is normal. I'll start investigating on my own, outside the house, places he's not monitoring. Don't change your behavior. Keep speaking in code. I'll figure something out." Elena grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard, tears streaming down her face again. She mouthed, "I'm sorry," and I shook my head. She had nothing to apologize for. She was being victimized by a predator, and she'd been trying to protect me while still asking for help. That took incredible courage. The next morning I went to work as usual, but instead of going to my office, I drove to a library 3 towns over, somewhere Jeffrey wouldn't have reason to monitor or follow me. I used one of their public computers with a privacy screen and started researching Jeffrey Vaughn. What I found was disturbing. He'd been fired from Elena's pharmaceutical company 4 years ago for attempting to steal proprietary research and sell it to a competitor. He'd been caught before any significant damage was done, and the company had chosen not to press charges to avoid publicity. Jeffrey had worked at 2 other companies since then, getting fired from both within a year for similar issues. He'd become increasingly desperate for money and apparently had decided to extort Elena for the research access he could no longer get legitimately. I found his current address, an apartment in the city about 30 minutes from our house. I found his car registration, a black sedan. I found his phone number listed on an old resume posted on a job board. Armed with this information, I drove to his apartment building and parked across the street, watching. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, just hoping to observe something that might help. I sat there for 3 hours before Jeffrey emerged, carrying a laptop bag and briefcase. He was in his 50s, balding, with the look of someone who'd once been successful, but had let himself go. He got into the black sedan and drove away. I followed at a distance. Jeffrey drove to a coffee shop and set up at a table near the window, opening his laptop and pulling out files from his briefcase. I parked and waited, watching him through binoculars I'd bought at a sporting goods store on the way. He worked for about an hour, then made a phone call that lasted 10 minutes. His expression was angry and animated. After the call ended, he closed his laptop with more force than necessary and left the coffee shop looking agitated. I followed him to 3 more locations over the next 4 hours. A shipping store where he mailed a package, a bank where he spent 20 minutes inside, and finally back to his apartment. I'd learned his routine and his temper, but nothing that seemed immediately useful. I needed to know more about his surveillance setup and how he was monitoring Elena and our home. I needed to find out if he was working alone or if he had help. Most importantly, I needed evidence of his crimes that I could take to authorities without triggering his threat against me. That night, I told Elena through written notes that I'd located Jeffrey and was working on a plan. She wrote back asking me to be careful, that Jeffrey was unstable and dangerous. I promised I would be, but privately I was terrified. I wasn't an investigator or a security expert. I was an accountant who worked with spreadsheets and tax codes. But I was also a husband who would do anything to protect his wife. Over the next 2 weeks, I established a pattern of going to that library during my lunch breaks, using their computers to research surveillance technology and how to detect it. I learned that Jeffrey had likely installed wireless cameras and audio devices that transmitted to his laptop or phone. These devices could be hidden in smoke detectors, electrical outlets, USB chargers, even picture frames. Finding them would require a radio frequency detector, which I ordered online and had delivered to my office instead of our home. When it arrived, I brought it home hidden in my briefcase and told Elena through a note that I was going to sweep the house that weekend while making it look like I was doing normal household maintenance. On Saturday morning, I announced loudly that I was going to check all our smoke detectors and replace batteries. Elena nodded and continued making breakfast, speaking her coded phrases about each electronic surveilled and system a tick monitoring. I went through every room with the RF detector hidden in my pocket, checking smoke detectors, outlets, lamps, and anything else that could conceal a device. I found 6 cameras and 4 audio devices hidden throughout our house. 2 cameras in our bedroom, 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the living room, 1 in Elena's home office, and 1 in the garage. Audio devices in the bedroom, kitchen, home office, and 1 in the main bathroom. My skin crawled, knowing Jeffrey had been watching us sleep, watching our most intimate moments, listening to our private conversations. I couldn't remove the devices without alerting Jeffrey that we knew about them. Instead, I documented their locations with photos taken on a disposable camera I'd bought with cash. I also noted the makes and models when I could see them, information I could use later. The devices were all top-tier commercial equipment, not cheap home security cameras. Jeffrey must have spent thousands on his surveillance setup, which suggested he was making good money from selling Elena's research data. That gave me an idea. If Jeffrey was selling pharmaceutical research to competitors, there would be a money trail. Electronic transfers, payments, communications with buyers. If I could find evidence of those transactions, I could build a case against him that didn't rely solely on Elena's testimony, which might be dismissed as a disgruntled former employee making accusations. I needed to get access to Jeffrey's financial records and communications. That meant getting into his apartment or hacking his devices, both of which were illegal and dangerous. But I couldn't see another option. Going to the police now would trigger Jeffrey's threat. We needed evidence strong enough to have him arrested immediately before he could retaliate. I explained this to Elena through written notes, and she agreed, though she was terrified of the risk I'd be taking. We decided I'd attempt to access his apartment when I knew he was away from home. The opportunity came the following week. I'd continued monitoring Jeffrey's routine and learned he attended a weekly networking event every Thursday evening from 6 to 9 p.m. He was apparently trying to rebuild his professional reputation and find new employment, unsuccessfully based on his frustrated demeanor when he returned from these events. On that Thursday, I told Elena I had to work late and left the house at my normal time, but instead drove to Jeffrey's apartment building. I'd watched YouTube videos on lockpicking and bought a basic set of picks, practicing on my own front door until I could open it consistently. Jeffrey's apartment had a standard pin tumbler lock, nothing fancy. I wore gloves and a baseball cap pulled low, keeping my face down to avoid any security cameras in the building hallways. My hands shook as I worked the lock. But after 90 seconds of careful manipulation, the door opened. I slipped inside and closed it quickly, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The apartment was small and messy, filled with files and papers and computer equipment. Jeffrey clearly lived and worked from this space. I pulled out a portable hard drive I'd brought and went to his laptop, which was sitting open on the dining table. It was password protected, but Jeffrey had made a critical mistake. He'd left himself logged into email on his phone, which was charging on the kitchen counter. I used the phone to access his email and found exactly what I needed. Jeffrey had been systematic about documenting his crimes. His emails contained correspondence with 3 different pharmaceutical companies, negotiations about pricing for proprietary research data, complaints about delivery delays, threats when payments were late. He'd sold information dozens of times over the past 3 months, making nearly $200,000. There were also emails detailing his surveillance of Elena and our home, including messages to a tech consultant who'd helped him install the cameras and audio devices. Jeffrey had paid this consultant $15,000 for the setup and ongoing monitoring assistance. More damning were emails discussing his threats against me, including specific plans for how he'd cause an accident that would look natural. He'd researched car tampering methods, looked into hiring someone to stage a mugging gone wrong, and discussed with the tech consultant how to intercept police calls if Elena tried to report him. Reading these emails made me physically ill. This man had been planning my murder in meticulous detail while watching us live our lives. I copied everything to my hard drive, thousands of emails containing undeniable evidence of extortion, corporate espionage, stalking, and conspiracy to commit murder. I also found files on his laptop containing the research data Elena had been forced to give him, along with Jeffrey's sales records tracking what he'd sold and to whom. I copied all of it. I was about to leave when I heard the apartment door unlock. Jeffrey was home early. I had maybe 5 seconds before he walked in. I grabbed my hard drive and shoved it in my jacket pocket, then looked around desperately for a hiding place. The apartment was small, with nowhere to go. I dove behind a heavy couch just as the door opened. Jeffrey entered, talking loudly on his phone, sounding angry about something that had happened at his networking event. He paced around the apartment, his footsteps passing close to where I crouched behind the couch. I held my breath, trying not to move or make any sound. He went to the kitchen and I heard him opening the refrigerator, pouring something to drink, still talking on the phone about how former colleagues were freezing him out and refusing to give him references. His victim mentality was stunning given what he was doing to Elena. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, he finally ended the call and went into his bedroom. I heard the shower start. This was my chance. I crept out from behind the couch and moved toward the door, trying to step quietly on the creaky floor. I was 3 feet from the door when my phone vibrated in my pocket. The sound was small, but in the silent apartment, it might as well have been a gunshot. The shower turned off immediately. Jeffrey called out, asking if someone was there. I abandoned stealth and ran for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hallway. Behind me, I heard Jeffrey shouting. I hit the stairs and took them 3 at a time, bursting out the building's front entrance just as Jeffrey appeared at the top of the stairwell wearing only a towel. I ran to my car and drove away, my hands shaking so badly I nearly crashed twice on the way home. Elena was waiting anxiously when I got home, having heard me arrive and seen my panicked state. I wrote quickly on a notepad explaining what had happened, that Jeffrey had come home early and might know someone had been in his apartment. If he checked his laptop, he'd see someone had accessed his files. We might not have much time before he retaliated. Elena's face went pale. She wrote, "What do we do?" I wrote back, "We go to the FBI, tonight, right now. I have enough evidence to bury him. He can threaten all he wants, but once federal agents are involved, he'll be too busy being arrested to do anything to us." Elena hesitated, then nodded. We grabbed our laptops and phones, the hard drive with Jeffrey's data, and the documentation I'd collected about the surveillance devices. We walked out to our car, trying to look normal, in case Jeffrey was monitoring the camera in our garage. I drove toward the FBI field office downtown, constantly checking my mirrors for signs we were being followed. About halfway there, Elena's phone rang. She looked at the screen and her face went white. It was Jeffrey. She answered on speaker without saying anything. Jeffrey's voice came through angry and threatening. He said he knew someone had broken into his apartment and accessed his computer. He said he knew it was me, that his tech consultant had alerts set up for unauthorized access. He said I'd just signed my own death warrant and he was coming for me right now. He knew we'd left the house and he was tracking our car's GPS. In 10 minutes he'd intercept us and we'd both disappear. The call ended. I accelerated, weaving through traffic while Elena called 911. She tried to explain the situation, but the dispatcher seemed confused by the complicated story and kept asking questions that slowed everything down. I shouted our location and that we were being pursued by someone who'd threatened to kill us, that we needed immediate police response. The dispatcher said she was sending units to our location, but it would take several minutes. We didn't have several minutes. I saw a black sedan appear in my rearview mirror, driving aggressively and closing the distance. Jeffrey had found us. I took the next exit and started driving through residential neighborhoods, taking random turns trying to lose him. Jeffrey stayed with us, his sedan powerful and fast. Elena was crying and praying, gripping her seatbelt while I drove faster than I'd ever driven in my life. I blew through stop signs and red lights, praying I wouldn't hit anyone, just focused on keeping distance between us and Jeffrey's car. Then I saw police lights ahead, 2 patrol cars responding to the 911 call. I drove straight toward them and stopped in the middle of the street, blocking traffic. Jeffrey's sedan screeched to a halt behind us. I jumped out of my car with my hands up, shouting that the man in the black sedan was trying to kill us, that we had evidence of his crimes, that we needed protection, immediately. The officers approached cautiously, hands on their weapons, trying to assess the situation. Jeffrey made a critical mistake. Instead of stopping and playing innocent, he panicked and tried to drive away. The officers immediately pursued, boxing him in before he could escape. The next 6 hours were a blur of police stations, interviews, evidence review, and FBI involvement. I showed them everything I'd copied from Jeffrey's laptop, the emails, the sales records, the research data, the surveillance documentation. Elena corroborated everything, explaining in her normal voice for the first time in months how Jeffrey had been extorting her and threatening me. The FBI agents were initially skeptical about the source of the evidence given I'd obtained it through breaking into Jeffrey's apartment, but the sheer volume and detail of his crimes was overwhelming. They executed a proper search warrant on his apartment and found everything I'd described plus more. Jeffrey's tech consultant was located and arrested within hours, immediately offering to testify against Jeffrey in exchange for a reduced sentence. The consultant provided additional evidence about the surveillance setup and Jeffrey's plans for causing my accident. The pharmaceutical companies Jeffrey had been selling research to were contacted and confirmed the purchases, some of them unaware the data was stolen. Within 3 days, federal prosecutors had built an airtight case against Jeffrey for extortion, corporate espionage, stalking, making terroristic threats, and conspiracy to commit murder. His bail was denied, given the severity of the charges and evidence of flight risk. He'd spend the next months in jail awaiting trial. The trial took 8 months to reach court. Elena and I both testified about the psychological torture of living under constant surveillance and threats. The tech consultant testified about installing the cameras and monitoring our home. Digital forensics experts testified about the evidence on Jeffrey's devices. The pharmaceutical companies testified about purchasing stolen research data. Jeffrey's defense tried to paint him as a desperate man driven to poor choices by unemployment and financial stress. But the prosecutors systematically destroyed that narrative by showing his meticulous planning, his expensive surveillance setup, and his detailed murder plans. This wasn't a desperate man making mistakes. This was a calculated predator who turned my wife into an unwilling accomplice and treated our lives as disposable obstacles. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 23 years in federal prison, calling his actions a violation of basic human dignity and a betrayal of scientific ethics. Jeffrey showed no remorse at sentencing, instead glaring at Elena and me with hatred that made clear he still viewed us as the problem rather than himself as the perpetrator. Elena and I went through intensive therapy to process the trauma. She struggled with guilt about not finding a way to stop Jeffrey sooner, about putting me in danger, about being forced to betray her employer's trust. Her therapist helped her understand she'd been victimized and had shown remarkable resilience by creating the coded language to ask for help without alerting her abuser. I struggled with the violation of having been watched in my own home and the knowledge that I'd come close to being murdered by someone I'd never even met before this situation. Our home had to be completely debugged, and we eventually moved to a new house in a different city, unable to feel safe in the space Jeffrey had invaded. Elena changed careers, unable to return to pharmaceutical research after what Jeffrey had done. She became an advocate for victims of workplace retaliation and digital stalking, using her experience to help others recognize warning signs and seek help. The coded language she'd invented became something we studied with security experts, understanding it as an innovative response to an impossible situation where normal communication was impossible. 3 years after Jeffrey's conviction, Elena and I stood in our new kitchen in our new home, truly alone for the first time in years, without fear of surveillance or threat. She spoke to me in completely normal English, no strange pronunciations or hidden meanings, and said she loved me. I held her close and told her I loved her too. The nightmare was over. We'd survived by trusting each other even when communication was compromised, by refusing to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. Jeffrey Vaughn was in prison, and we were free. That had to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.